Hello, piece of the recording that's going to get cut. As long as everything works out the way it's supposed to, this should never be seen, like my microphone. If I can keep that right out of the way, get the gain right. There we go. It's like it was never there. Okay. Set up my whiteboard. There we go. I'm going to start here with a big old black square. And some text up here. How about no typos in there? How about that? Okay. Now we'll do some white text. Let me get these side by side. Okay, so that's how you make a whiteboard icebreaker. I think it looks pretty good. I always like to get here a few minutes early just to set something up so that when people arrive, there's something here. And also, this unofficial start lets me create a frame for people to engage as soon as they get here if they want to. It also allows people to enter late so that somebody enters late, then they're not going to miss any critical content because we're wrapping up this exercise. Oh, how about I open up my slides? That'll be useful. I might need these today. go. Boom. Hello. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to get started in a little bit, but while we're waiting, I thought we could share our hidden talents. So if you have a hidden talent and you know how to use the Zoom whiteboard, there's some instructions in the upper right-hand corner that show you how to open the annotation toolbar. But it's kind of tricky to find. So if you want to just share with me verbally what your hidden talent is, I'm going to write everybody's hidden talents up here. Mine is infectious laughter. People always laugh when I laugh. So you can feel free to write yours in the chat box or bring yourself off of mute and share with me, what's your hidden talent? Somebody knows how to draw. Well done. Was that you, Jenna? Great, great. Keep it going. Let me see you write it up there. What about you, Hazel? Do you have a hidden talent you could share with us? It could be silly. Wiggling your ears, touching your tongue to your nose, can be anything that you like. Nice. Making silly jokes to get people with awesome laughs to laugh. Great. Do you have a silly joke you could share right now?
That was me. I'm a fan of puns. What's a good one that I
Are you?
heard? Yes, definitely.
I like jokes that are punny.
Everyone probably heard this one, but during the lockdown, what were the funniest jokes? Inside jokes.
That's great. Yeah.
That's a great laugh.
Jokes go over the best. Thanks. Great. Double jointed. Nice. Can you show us the double jointed fingers? I'd love to see this.
I don't want to see it.
Whoa. That's great. Great. My kids love this trick where you take your thumb and you pop it right off. They love that. It still works. Don't worry. What about you, Courtney? Do you have a hidden talent you could share with us?
Are we meant to be typing this into this?
If you feel confident in using the annotation toolbar, but if not, you could just share it in the chat or you can share it verbally.
Yeah, I'm gonna need to experiment with annotation. I now think of myself as a bread wizard post-lockdown. I'm gonna call that my hidden talent. It's not hidden because I boast about it.
Bread wizard. It sounds like an office when you put it that way. I am the bread wizard.
I can confirm Courtney's bread is awesome.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody calls themselves a bread wizard without other people validating them. Hi, Hannah. Thanks for joining us. We're waiting for a couple more people to arrive. And while we're waiting, we're sharing our hidden talents. So if you have a hidden talent, you can type it in the chat box, or you can come off of mute and share with us that one thing you do that makes everybody else amazed when you do it. So if any of you were on my presentation on Wednesday for Tech Week, Be a Better Zoom Host, this activity that we're doing right now is called the unofficial start. And it provides something for people who arrive early so that we can immediately engage. And it also lets us extend the official start time by just a couple of minutes. so that if somebody arrives late, then they're not missing any critical content. And I'll give it about another minute for our last registrants to arrive. Wow, Hannah, that's amazing. You could be not sure off the top of your head. That's incredible. That's a great talent. I love it. One of the reasons I like hidden talents for a workshop like this is because everybody has hidden talents, even people with disabilities. And so this is an inclusive exercise where whether or not somebody can use the annotation toolbar, whether or not somebody can chat, by providing multiple avenues for people to participate in this, even if they're impaired in some way, they can still fully participate in the exercise. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to share some slides with you. Here we go. All right. So thank you so much for coming. Today's presentation is called Accessibility in Webinars, where we're going to achieve Matt May's goal. Matt May is the head of inclusion at Adobe. And he says that what we have are a few people who know a lot about accessibility. And what we need are a lot of people to know a little bit. And I'm one of those people who knows a little bit. I'm not an expert in accessibility. I've been a web designer for 10 years, and so I'm familiar with the accessibility protocols of websites. And I'm also a speaker, and so I've been familiar with how to be accessible on live events. But there's surprisingly little in the overlap between the two about how to be accessible in virtual events and webinars. And so that's what we're doing today, is we're learning a little bit about accessibility. So I appreciate you coming here and spending some time with me so that we can all upskill ourselves in accessibility. And what I'd like to do now is stop sharing my screen and come into gallery mode. In the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom toolbar, or of your Zoom screen, there's a button that says either gallery view or speaker view. And I'd like you to toggle that until we're in gallery view. And I'd like everybody to introduce themselves briefly, who you are, what you do, why you're amazing. Let us know which one of those camps you fall into. Do you know a lot about accessibility or a little about accessibility? And then share with us how accessibility intersects with your work. Jana, would you like to start?
Sure. My name is Jana Makar. I'm Canadian, but living in New Zealand for the last 8 years. I work in communications with a tech-focused organization, and we work with a lot of academic researchers, often giving webinars and hosting online events. And so I'm really keen to be more aware of accessibility, but I know little about it. I'm in a privileged situation where I don't have any obvious accessibility issues that I'm aware of, but I definitely want to incorporate that more into our considerations when we're delivering these sorts of events. And so definitely keen to learn more and think about it, put it more front of mind instead of it being afterthoughts as well, which I find can often happen.
Great point. Yeah, thank you so much for coming, Jenna. Hazel, tell us about you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Hazel. I'm in New Zealand, and I work at the Centre for Science and Society alongside Courtney, which is how I know about her bread. We do a lot of online teaching, so courses that are designed to be online. And I'm the senior tutor in the centre, so part of my role is to think about ways that we can improve our online courses and how accessible they are. So I guess I know a little about accessibility, but would love to know more.
Brilliant. Thank you for coming, Hazel. Courtney, tell us about you and your bread.
I'll spare you the bread stories. So I'm Courtney Edison. I'm a lecturer in the Centre of Science and Society with Hazel at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University. I am an anthropologist by training, and like Hazel, a lot of my teaching is online. A lot of our teaching collectively is online. So we are sort of thinking about how we can make the different sort of platforms that we work on maximally accessible and accessible from the get-go rather than, being reactive. And I would say I know, just a little, and I would like to know more. What I do know is sort of from the academic literature more than the sort of, I guess, lived experiences. So very happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you for coming, Courtney. Hannah, tell us about you. If you feel comfortable, if you'd like to stay on mute, it's quite all right. She says in the chat, she's a Kiwi 2, working in a mental health support startup and in the process of upskilling. Happy to be learning more about the digital workspace. Thank you so much for coming, Hannah. I'm really glad you're here. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen again. We're going to go into some slides, and this is going to be a presentation-heavy meeting, where I am going to be talking a lot because there's a lot of information that I'm going to be sharing with you visually and verbally. And for those of you watching during the replay, there will be a slide link somewhere around the video replay, and there will be time at the end for Q&A. So I'll try and have everything wrapped up before the top of the hour, but if we extend beyond that for Q&A, I'm happy to stick around beyond that. But I totally recognize if you have other things to do and you need to leave, please duck out whenever you need to. All right, so here's the agenda of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go over WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and the different types of accessibility that we can accommodate in our virtual meetings. I'll go into details about closed captioning in Zoom, because there's a lot of ins and outs on how that can and can't work. And then we'll go over the best practices for delivering presentations inclusively. And I'm also going to share with everyone the webinar accessibility checklist. For those of you who registered live, or for the live session, then this will be in. This was sent out yesterday with the slides, and I'll send a link with this again with the replay later. The reason why I think this is an important topic is because people with disabilities are 3 times as likely as those without disabilities to say they never go online. 8% of the general population says, oh, I never go online. 23% of people with disabilities say the same thing. And I think it's because it's a hostile environment for accessibility. For people with impairments, it's not designed for them first. Like you said earlier, Courtney, accessibility is often an afterthought. And so the more that we can design and create our media and our live experiences inclusive of people with disabilities, the more welcoming it will be for everyone. And as I mentioned earlier, there's plenty of content on how to make a live meeting accessible. And there's lots of content on how to make websites accessible. But this overlap is new. When quarantine happened in the spring of 2020, everyone had to suddenly go online. And I was doing a lot of consulting work with agencies that taught face-to-face workshops. And they had to immediately get to a virtual workshop. And since I know the ins and outs of webinars and hosting and presenting virtually, I know a lot of people were bored during quarantine, but it was one of the busiest times of my career, because people found out that I can take a face-to-face workshop and convert it to a virtual webinar. I was swamped. And one of my clients was a disability advocacy organization. And they said, we need to take our face-to-face workshops on how to implement inclusiveness and accessibility from face-to-face to virtual. And we need this workshop to be as accessible as possible. And I said, okay, I'm going to go find the manual on how to do it. And there wasn't one. So I wrote it, and that's what the webinar accessibility checklist has become. It's a conglomeration of the research and the best practices and the technical tools needed to create an inclusive virtual meeting. But I used a lot of WCAG to guide me in creating that document. WCAG which stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, has 3 different grades. It provides specific testable rules so that you can determine how accessible is my website. If it's A, it has the bare minimum level of accessibility. It means that people using assistive technologies can interact with the website. AA is required by the EU government and by a lot of public websites. And it's got higher contrast requirements. It's got better interactivity requirements. And then there's AAA. And AAA is typically specialized. So for websites that cater exclusively to people with Braille readers, for example, that's going to be a AAA level of web content accessibility. And most websites don't need AAA. AA is kind of the gold standard for a general audience, and A is seen as entry level. Once you hit A, you are accessible. And the great thing about these guidelines is you can apply the rules and test your website to get a grade. And if you don't meet the grade you want, it can tell you exactly what you need to do in order to achieve that grade. There are 4 different categories of the guidelines. They say that a website needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I'm going to go through each of these in turn. This is a slide of a magnifying glass that shows a cutout cardboard person. And this slide is perceivable, both visually and auditorily, because I've given an audio description of this slide. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be verbally describing the images that we see. There was a slide a few slides back with 2 images on it. There was a picture of empty chairs representing a live meeting and a picture of a monitor representing a website. And do you remember when I was talking about meetings and websites? If you were watching that as a visually impaired person, you wouldn't be able to interpret the full scope of what I was presenting, because you needed to visually interpret the slide. So by giving an audio description, I'm making my slides perceivable. And I'll continue doing that for the rest of today's presentation. What perceivable means in WCAG guidelines is that it is available to the senses, to sight, to hearing, and or touch. And those are the three senses that we need to make something perceivable through. A website also needs to be operable. And this is a photograph of hands at a keyboard. And a keyboard is often the primary method that people with different types of assistive technologies use to interact with the internet. Because unlike a mouse, which requires fine motor control or vision ability, a keyboard can be used by people with many different kinds of disability. When something is operable, it means that they can use the interface. They can navigate through the website. They can use the controls. If someone with a disability can't operate the website, then it's not accessible. A website also needs to be understandable. And this is a photo with text and images on it. And if you walk dogs at a dog park, you may have seen a similar sign. What I like about this sign is that it's accessible for people who don't speak English. It says in text, "Please clean up after your pet." And then there are 3 images that are illustrations of someone cleaning up after their pet. So it's understandable to anyone who can see it. And this slide describes that information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable for people with any kind of disability. Finally, a website needs to be robust. And this image has graffiti that says robust in big, bold letters. And I happen to be a fan of graffiti. It's a very interesting art form. And it also visually illustrates the difference between a sign that says robust or that boring text at the top of this slide. But then when you see the robustness of the graffiti, you can see the difference in the experience. And when someone is interacting with a website with assistive technology, it should be just as robust of an experience as somebody who's using it without assistive technology. So these are the 4 categories of guidelines in WCAG: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. For virtual meetings, we really only need these 2. And on this slide, I've crossed out the second two, understandable and robust. We don't need to do a lot of interactivity or provide a lot of interactivity ourselves. A lot of this is taken care of by Zoom. Zoom handles the understandable and the robustness part of it. What our responsibility is, as the leaders of virtual meetings and webinars, is to make sure that our meetings are perceivable and operable. So what does that mean? Well, according to the University of Washington, they have a really great breakdown on their accessibility page. And I include a link to this in the webinar accessibility checklist. They say that an accessible video includes captions, a transcript, and audio description. And if you have all three of those, then it's an accessible video. Once again, this is an image with a magnifying glass of a cutout person. And you can perceive this because I'm providing an audio description. And when we look at what's operable, such as this image that has a hands on a keyboard, we can look to the Zoom interface. And the Zoom interface is fully keyboard accessible. Their accessibility complies with WCAG guidelines version 2.1. They have a great accessibility page. And you can use any of the major features in Zoom without fine motor control. As long as you have a keyboard and you can operate the keyboard, you can replicate anything that you need to do in Zoom. And their keyboard shortcuts can be enabled globally. So even if you're in another program, you can say, hey, Zoom, put me on mute with a simple hotkey. And we're not going to go over these very much because this isn't a training about how to interact accessibly yourself, but rather how to provide that accessibility for others. And so I want to take a look at these visual icons. There are two icons on the screen here. And I was in a meeting once where someone with visual impairment, she had low light impairment, she had about 40% vision. And she was asked to identify these two icons that are commonly seen in the Zoom toolbar. And she said, well, that's a hot water bottle and that's a dentist chair. And you can see visually how she could make that, that mistake. It wasn't even really a mistake. This is how she interpreted it. So from her position, it was correct because that does look like a hot water bottle and like a dentist chair. But we provide alt text so that we can clarify what images are supposed to represent. Now you can't unsee it, Jana. Yeah, you'll see it all the time after this. I always see it. So the alt text that Zoom provides for these icons in the toolbar is a camera and a microphone. And that's what these icons are meant to represent. And in websites, using alt text helps someone who's navigating a website with a screen reader interpret the images. They can perceive them because of the alt text. And as a web designer, I'll confess, it's easy to run into mistakes with images. This is an image of 3 ovals, which is commonly called a hamburger menu. And over on the right side, I've got an image of a phone with my website on it. On CaelanHuntress.com, it doesn't have the whole menu on the mobile site. It reduces the menu down to this hamburger menu, so that when you click on this, it expands the menu, and then you see the navigation options. Unfortunately, I left the alt text as hamburger. So if somebody was reading this on a screen reader, then they would see, oh, that's where the hamburger is on his website. So this is an alt text with a facepalm on it. And I say this as a web designer, it's a common mistake to overlook these things, which is why we need to continually educate ourselves a little bit about accessibility. One of the ways that we can do this is through learning the inclusive design principles. And there's a website at inclusivedesignprinciples.org that lists these principles. And if you go to visit this website, you'll see this same screenshot, but you can hit these plus buttons to read in detail what these principles are. And I'll read them off briefly. The inclusive design principles are to provide a comparable experience, consider the situation, be consistent, give control, offer choice, prioritize content, and add value. And if you use these principles in your design, then you'll be more inclusive. The Center for Universal Design at the University of North Carolina defines universal design as the design of products and environments to be usable by people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. If you can design it accessibly first, so that you don't need to have a regular version and then an accessible version for others, then you're using universal design because you're designing once for everybody. And that's the principle that I've tried to take with providing these different guidelines, except for this slide. I'm giving you this slide to demonstrate what happens when you don't use universal design. If you can see it, the first line says use 1 or 2 lines of text. And then I listed a whole bunch of other things on one slide. And even those of us who are visually abled can see why this is a bad move design-wise. I'm not going to go through the other items on here because they are in the accessibility checklist, so you can review them there later. But I wanted to illustrate what could happen if you don't use accessible design. And this slide has an image of the cover of the website accessibility checklist. So when you're designing things visually, the first thing to do is make sure that you're using color contrast and size that can accommodate people who have low vision impairment. Here's some examples of color contrast. We've got 3 kinds of text. There's green text, red text, and blue text. The green text is very difficult to read. It has a contrast ratio of 1.4 to 1. The red text is easier. It's 4 to 1. And the blue text, this color blue is a very different color than the white background. So the contrast ratio is much higher. It's 8.6 to 1. But if you notice, even the green text, which is so difficult to read right now, when we make it bigger, it's more legible. The same colors and the same text can have a different contrast ratio depending on the size. So this image is in the website accessibility checklist, and it describes some different contrast ratios that you can use for colors and backgrounds. If you want to have a AAA WCAG rating, your contrast ratio needs to be 7 to 1. Really stark differences between foreground and background. You can go as low as 3 to 1 and still have a AA rating if you're at 18 points font size or above. So the bigger your font is, the more forgiving the contrast ratio. The smaller your font is, the bigger the difference between foreground and background. And there's a link above this image in the checklist that goes through all the, that has a, excuse me, a little error there, that has all the, some different contrast checkers you can use. And you can go onto the contrast checker website, pop in some hex codes, and see what the contrast ratio is. So this is a picture of a meme, which is a typical way for visually abled people to share jokes on the internet. And you can see the contrast here. It's white text on different kinds of blue with a black border. Some of the best practices that we use in graphic design is to have a solid background behind text and not to put text over a photo. But you can see how those rules were bent here. Where it says white shirt, it's actually over the photo of this kid's head. What this meme says is ate spaghetti while wearing a white shirt. And then this kid is saying, yes, the success kid. And it says at the bottom, didn't get sauce on it. Now with alt text, we can't really convey that joke visually. And there's some interesting debates going on in visual impairment communities about what do we do with alt text on memes? How do we make this perceivable? But what I really want you to notice is how the contrast here is used. Clear capital letters with borders allows us to break those typical graphic design rules so that it still maintains legibility, even though it's got a difficult background. So this is a photo of Beverly Riddick, who is using a screen reader to navigate the internet. And she is fully blind. And by using the keyboard in front of her and a headset, she can navigate through the different fields on a website and hear her screen reader tell her what the different fields are and what they mean. And this is a video demonstrating what a screen reader is like. And I'm going to play this video. It's 2.5 minutes long.
From the University of California, San Francisco's IT Web Services Department. Here today with a brief tour of screen reading technology. I'm a blind person who has been using screen readers, braille writers, scanning equipment, other adaptive technologies since my childhood. What a screen reader does is, for example, I'm going to start to read this page. And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate. 75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link, UCSF Medical Center. So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information that can be displayed through synthetic speech or braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse. You can also use a braille display as an input device. End of navigation. And what it does is it cleverly determines what's on the screen and presents you that information in a way that would allow for efficient navigation of these pages. So for example, I could just keep reading. Banner 3 items. Visited, link, image, home. Line by line, and we could be here all day. Or I could jump to the first heading on the page. Heading level 2, search for heading level 2. You are here. Heading level 1, make videos accessible. So as I'm moving down through the page, I can look for the category that interests me. And I'm just using commands built into the screen reader. So that's all pretty simple description of what a screen reader is all about. Now I'm going to go over and show a few examples of how that can fall apart. So I have a couple graphics on this page. Mark Sutton hands on a MacBook Pro image. So the first one is well described and uses an alt tag. You are currently on it. To describe what that graphic is all about. Now we go to the next graphic. Reader 042116.jpg. Much less useful. So it's important to use those elements.
So that's what a screen reader looks like when it's being used. Pop quiz. Are screen readers accessible, or excuse me, are shared screens in Zoom accessible to screen readers? What do we think? I'm going to launch a poll. Oops, wrong poll. Have you ever done a poll before? Wrong one. Sorry, 1 second. I think I might have just spoiled the answer here. Oh, darn, the polls didn't come through. Well, I was going to illustrate anyway that polls are not a fully accessible method of using Zoom. Because if we provide a poll, why wouldn't that be accessible? Why wouldn't everybody be able to interact with a poll? Any guesses? What disability could keep you from using a poll? Jana, you have a thought?
Well, I was going to say, if you're not able to verbally contribute an answer, then that, negates that option. But I'm surprised that if Zoom has other keyboard shortcuts, they don't have one for that, for polls?
Well, if you're visually impaired.
Oh, but you wouldn't know the options.
You see it.
Right, yeah.
And if you don't have fine motor control, you can't use the mouse to get there. Now, to my knowledge, there's not a keyboard shortcut to navigate through the poll options. There may be. I actually need to do some research on that. But the most accessible way to have a poll is like I've done here, to verbally offer the question and then offer different ways for people to participate. They can type in the chat, they can come off of mute, things like that. But shared screens, like what you're seeing right now, is not accessible to screen readers. When people use a screen reader, to interpret what Zoom is providing to them, it says, okay, this is an HD video stream. I have no idea what's in it. It doesn't have anything to navigate through. But when they're using a screen reader, which uses one of these different programs to interpret visually and translate into audio, what you can do is you can send the slides in advance, because slides are readable by screen readers. And so if you provide the slides a day in advance, it lets visually disabled people run through your slides with a screen reader so that they can perceive your content. Of course, they can also perceive it if you describe each slide as you present. So these are two best practices that you can use to make sure that visually impaired people can perceive your slides. As Stevie Wonder said, the great blind musician, we need to make every single thing accessible to every single person with a disability. And this is something I've only been doing recently, is challenging every piece of media I create with this question. Is this accessible for every single person with a disability? And it's a tough challenge. But if you interact with your own creations that way, it helps improve everything that you create from here on out. So we've done a lot of talking about visual assistance. Now let's talk about audio assistance. When you're hosting a virtual meeting, the three basic options are sign language, transcription, and captioning. Sign language is a good live solution for people who are in your geography and speak your dialect. But New Zealand Sign Language is different than American Sign Language, and it's different than Australian Sign Language. And so while it may be accessible for people who speak that dialect, for others it's not. So what a lot of people do as the basic grade A entry level of accessibility is transcription. And Zoom has an easy transcription process that you can do so that your recording can be delivered with a transcription file. But the AA version here is captioning. Captions are transcriptions that are either live or provided after the fact, and they're included in the video stream itself. And it helps not just for people who are hard of hearing, but also for people who don't speak English fluently, so that when they see the transcription, they can read what's being said. So this is a picture of a Zoom grid where I was teaching this workshop last month. We had lots of people on, and I photoshopped Alan Wendt in here as a sign language interpreter in the upper left. And Alan Wendt, if you don't know him, he is a sign language interpreter in New Zealand. And I have a GIF here of a great moment in New Zealand sign language history when Alan Wendt used onomatopoeia to describe the East Coast Wave. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern was asked, what should people do instead of handshakes during quarantine? And she said, well, they can do an East Coast Wave. And she demonstrated it. And Alan Wendt, standing behind her, pointed to his face to demonstrate the East Coast Wave. And I spent more time than necessary making this GIF, but I just loved this moment in sign language history so much that I wanted to do it. So this is an image of a masterclass I taught a few months ago. And when Zoom gave me a transcript, it looked like this. Every time I took a pause, there was a timestamp. And I could go through and edit these out if I want to. But there's other times when I talk really fast because I'm an American and I have a lot of ideas, and then you get these big blocks of text. And so visually, I'm illustrating here the different ways that transcripts are automatically output. They may not be easy on the eyes. So even though you can automate them, they're not always going to be as convenient as you would like. And so sometimes adding in an editing layer in your transcripts can make them much more easy to read for people with disabilities. And then there's closed captioning. And you may notice something wrong with this image. This image has a man walking and talking, and the closed captions are covering his eyes which doesn't seem to be a principle of universal design. But there's another principle here, that in universal design, that critical visual content should not be covered by captioning. And so this is the next frame in that video, where Marco Antonio Santos Ramirez, the site director of Chichen Itza, had his name and title across the bottom of the screen. And so the closed captions were moved to the top for this scene so that critical visual content was not covered. And there's a lot of tiny little considerations like this with captioning, which is one of the reasons why captioning is difficult. If captioning was easy, we'd see it all the time. But it's challenging, especially in live environments, to provide good captions. You can have offline captioning, which is made after the fact, and it's provided for a replay or for a pre-recorded video, or you can have real-time captioning, which is when captions are provided in the live feed. Either of those could be open or closed captions. And open captioning is when everyone sees the captions. You can't turn them off. But closed captions can be toggled on or off by the viewer. And so watching the same video or the same presentation, two different people can be watching with captions or without. And that's the difference between open and closed captioning. For meetings, some of the options are you can add a transcript and use that to add captions later. You can type captions manually or assign someone else in your meeting to do it during the presentation. There's this one option I'll share with you with Google Slides. It's a quick and dirty option, but it does get some captions there, but I don't recommend it because the quality is pretty low. But what the gold standard is to purchase a third-party closed captioning service. And I'll describe what that's like. But first, I need to let you know that closed captions are not enabled by default. You may not see closed captions in your toolbar right now. Go ahead and take a look. You might need to go to the More option and see if it's there. If it's not there, what you need to do is visit this link, which I have in the slide, and I have a screenshot here of the two different toggles that you can turn on to manually enable captions. And every individual needs to do it. Just because I've enabled captions, it doesn't mean that you have it enabled. So you can't do it through the app. You actually have to go through the browser and go into your Zoom account to enable them there. And when your captions are enabled, you get this option. This is a screenshot of the closed caption button in the Zoom toolbar. And when you click this button, you can assign someone to type captions, and that's the second screenshot on this slide. You can select somebody to type captions or say, I will type them, and then you just type them through the meeting. Or you click this button that says copy the API token. And what that does is it allows you to interact with another third-party service. And you just paste in the API token there, and then closed captionings go through a feed. And I'll share with you how to set that up in just a moment. But first, I want to share with you this quick hack. There's a YouTube video that I have linked here that goes through this, where you can put your slides in Google Slides, and you can share and automatically get closed captions to turn on. It'll use AI to provide low quality captions. A lot of people call these craptions because the accuracy is below 90%. And it just keeps it going in a big block of text down at the bottom. So they're not great captions, but if you find yourself in a situation where you have someone who's hearing impaired and you need to get captions done fast, you can put your slides in Google Slides, share from there, hit the CC button, and then you'll get this block of text captions at the bottom. But really what we want to do is find a way to get real-time captioning, like in this screenshot of Felix the cat, where it's got his captions beneath him. And when he says things, it shows up. And you can have this done in one of two ways. You can either have AI automatically transcribe for you, or you can have a human transcribe for you. And AI is easier, but the quality is lower. The human transcription has the transcription pass through a human filter where they say, what's really being said here? What should this really say? But you can't do that automatically. This is a photo of a stenographer using a specialized machine to provide closed captions during a live event. And stenography is a specific type of typing where you don't type using letters, you type using phonemes. So when you hear a word, you type the sounds that come out because you can type those much faster. Stenography is a specialized skill. And if you have a stenographer available and listening to your live meeting, it's something that you need to schedule in advance. So this is a photo of 5 different logos of caption companies, and they charge anywhere from 6 to 60 cents per minute for offering a live transcriptionist. And what they'll do is they'll give you that API key that you need to paste in at the beginning of your meeting, and you need to schedule these interactions in advance, because your stenographer needs to be ready as soon as the meeting starts to start typing. And so the part of this service is scheduling and assigning a transcriber to be ready for your meeting. This is a photo of a calendar with some push pins in it. And what we're going to talk about now is what you can do before your meeting to make it accessible. Something we've already discussed: share your presentation files in advance. And also make sure they're accessible. One of the things that I've inserted into my process now is before I upload my slides to the shareable link where other people can access them, I go through every slide and I add alt text to every image. So that way it's an accessible slideshow, and someone with a screen reader can interpret and can perceive everything in the slides. It's also a good best practice to share an agenda of what we're going to be talking about. This helps people with learning disabilities stay on track so that they know what to expect from stage to stage in your meeting. And also, if you're going to be using acronyms, be sure and define those in advance. So if somebody has hearing impairment and they hear the acronym, if they don't know what the acronym stands for, having that sent to them in the pre-event email can help them perceive what you're communicating. This is a photo of somebody presenting online, and what we're going to talk about next is best practices for presenting accessibly. You've noticed that through this presentation, I've been describing each slide verbally, so that if you can see it, you can perceive it, but if you can't see it, you can still perceive it. This also helps when people are connecting via phone. You know, Zoom has a default option so that people can access your meeting by phone. And if somebody's calling in, even if they are visually abled, they're not going to know what's on your slides unless you tell them. Marcus Osterberg makes a great point about this. He says that we often use the blind as the example. But when we make things more accessible for visually impaired people, others can benefit. And you can see this when you're creating accessible media, that just because you're creating something with a higher contrast and a bigger font size, it's not just for people with disabilities. Everyone can perceive it better when we make something accessible. After you show something, take a pause. When you chat with someone, take a pause. Not only does this allow people who have learning disadvantages to keep up with the conversation, it also allows people with hearing disabilities to move into the conversation. People with hearing impairments, they don't have the same visual cues where we open a door for someone else to say something, you know? When I say "you know" at the end of a sentence, it lets those of us who are able to hear very well, we can understand that that's the end of my sentence and I'm opening the door for someone else. But for someone with hearing impairment, they don't get those minor cues. But a large pause, it provides an opportunity for everyone to say, should I be contributing now? And the more that we can open the door for others to contribute, the more likely that they will. If someone asks a question and they have a speech impairment, repeating the question can make sure that everyone can hear it. Even if someone doesn't have a speech impairment, if they phrase it in a way that is that has slang, or they're not articulating very clearly, by repeating the question clearly, it ensures that everyone can perceive it. This is a photo of someone facilitating a discussion virtually, and he's talking online through a screen with 4 different people. And when you're facilitating discussion, there's some specific things you can do to make your discussion more accessible. At the beginning of your meeting, ask everyone to introduce themselves. And this allows people who can't see all the faces, but can hear the voices. It lets them know who's talking and who's present at the meeting. When people begin to speak, if they state their name, it allows people who are only listening to understand who's talking. And so if we're sharing a discussion and I finish what I'm saying and Hazel begins talking, she can say, Hazel speaking, what I think is, and that quick little thumbtack right at the beginning of your statement, it ensures that people who can't see you still understand who they can perceive who's saying what. If someone provides you with some information and you don't quite understand it, the easiest thing you can do is to repeat what you think you understand. So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is, and then repeat back to them what you've heard. And if there's something that you didn't understand, asking them to clarify or to repeat that portion you didn't understand provides the space for people who may have difficulty in articulating what they're trying to say. Either because of a speech or a learning impairment, it may be difficult for them to communicate. And so providing the space for them to try again is a way to accessibly allow them into the conversation. People with hearing impairments, as I said before, they don't know those nonverbal cues of when it's time, when there's an open door to enter. And so you can use a resource like the Trace online hand-raising utility. And there's a link for this in the webinar accessibility checklist. And you can raise hands in Zoom, but then it just shows everybody who's raised their hand. It doesn't keep order. And so if you have a meeting that's larger than 3 or 4 people, you can use this resource. You pop a link in the chat at the beginning of the meeting, and then everybody can raise their hands, and then it lets the host know in order who's been waiting to speak. And so these resources are listed in the webinar accessibility checklist, and I'm going to go ahead and pop a link to that into Skype, into the chat here. One moment. So if you don't have that already, you can go ahead and open that in another tab and take a look through that later. It's got a lot of great resources in it. There's about 3 pages of links that I use in researching this. So there's a lot of in-depth resources if you want to go further. Also, if you want to go further in leading your own meetings, I'm teaching another workshop for Tech Week tomorrow. It's called Advanced Virtual Facilitation, and it's a 90-minute workshop that goes through the tech, the conversation, and the exercises that can make a great Zoom meeting. And I'm going to tell you real briefly about this workshop, and then we're going to jump into Q&A. This workshop is actually the first workshop in the 4-session Zoom Host Intensive that I provide. And this is an in-depth training program that provides a certification for virtual facilitation. And this is a 10-hour program which provides 1 CEU in the United States. I'm not qualified with NZQA yet, but I'm working on it. And so the programs this year are going to help me provide that certification to others in the future, and it will be retroactive. This digital badge granted on completion of the program is recognized by LinkedIn and the Open Badges Protocol. I did a lot of work with people who found themselves suddenly online. Such as Patrice Dennis, who works at Blueprint for Learning, a division of the WISE group. And they had a lot of people who taught workshops face-to-face, and they said, how do we teach virtually so that people are engaged, so they don't have Zoom fatigue, so that they keep their audience excited and enthusiastic? And it turned out a lot of my training wasn't on the tech. I mean, sure, there was a lot of tech necessary, tech training that for the facilitators to upskill into being able to provide their meetings virtually. But a lot of the training revolves around the theatricality of hosting a meeting, of making sure that people are engaged. And so a lot of the trainer work that I've been doing is more role playing, helping people with different kinds of exercises and giving them a safe space to practice those exercises with their peers before they try these out in the wild with the public. We role play a lot of questions so that we can see what it's like to ask an open-ended question and get feedback, and hear what happens when an introspective question falls flat, and get feedback from your peers on how to do it better. And then, of course, there's a lot of technical training in there so that you know how to use the Zoom tool well to provide exercises that are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic for all types of learners, so that you can collect registrations and provide invitations easily and seamlessly to your attendees. And the types of work that I've been doing has really helped people to provide better virtual meetings. And that's why I've been spending so much time on this, is because while we're so remote, it turns out that our connections through Zoom to our distributed communities is one of the ways that we can foster greater connection among our communities. So these 4 workshops are either once a day or once a week, depending on which cohort that you join. They're 90 minutes apiece. And the first workshop is going to be replicated in tomorrow's presentation. So for teachers who lead a class, for coaches who have group programs, for speakers who present virtually, and especially for managers who lead remote teams. This program is going to help optimize your connection speed. We're going to practice sharing screens so that you can play videos through screens. We're going to rehearse breakout rooms, and everybody's going to lead their own breakout room. And this is actually one of the exercises we're doing tomorrow, is everybody's going to practice launching their own breakout rooms. And we're going to go on through the ins and outs of polls and how to use polls. And then at the end of this program, the 4-session program, you'll have the digital badge. But if you want to just take the first session to see what it's like, I'm offering it at a real discounted price for Tech Week. And then if you take this workshop and you decide you want to upgrade to the entire 4-session program, I'll give you a 25% off discount from the entire Zoom Host Intensive. And so now I'm going to provide a link to the slides here in the chat so that everybody has a link to these if you'd like to see the slides later. And now I'd like to transition into Q&A. Thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. Do you have any questions about anything that we've covered, or any topics that we didn't cover deeply enough?
I have one question. This is
Sure.
Jana speaking. Your mention of breakout rooms, just in reference to your workshop tomorrow, but that got me thinking, what would your recommendations be for hosting a breakout room in an accessible way? Because now you've put people into a situation where you're not in control of being very cognizant of, saying anything that you're sharing, or identifying who's in the breakout room. Because when you're put in there, I think names appear at the bottom of the screen, but people may not think to reintroduce themselves. I guess, do you have any tips or thoughts there? Because I know we're starting to use breakout rooms quite a bit, because we see that as a way to make our sessions interactive and get people networking and intermingling.
Great question, Jenna. What I would recommend you do is that if you have a varied group where there are a number of people with disabilities and then a number of abled people, you're given the option in setting up a breakout room. You can either set them up in advance of who's going to be in which room, or when you launch the breakout rooms, you can actually drag and drop your participants. And so what you could do is have all of your, your visually disabled people in one room, for example, and the host has the ability to move from room to room. And so what you can do as the host is you can launch the breakout rooms and then go enter the room where they're going to need more attention. And then you can facilitate that extra attention for your attendees.
I'm sorry, I have one more question,
Sure.
Jana, again. Would it be appropriate in registration forms for events to ask people to identify if they have any disabilities so that you can, plan for that in advance?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I've seen a lot of people do is they have a tick box at the bottom of their registration fields. And if they, and the tick box says, I have disabilities that need accommodation or something similar. And if you tick that box, it opens up a hidden field that asks for more information. So you can take it in the registration form, but you know, as a web designer, I always like to decrease the number of steps in registration, because every additional step will decrease the likelihood that someone completes the form. And so what another option is, in the confirmation email, you can say, if you have any disabilities that require accommodation, please reply to this email and let us know how we can make this a better event for you. Any other questions? Comments, ideas?
Courtney speaking. I have one comment, oh, sorry, question that I might have just missed in the talk, and thank you. This was very informative. With the alt text that you can attach to images, I assume that that should be brief wherever possible, rather than sort of richly descriptive. Is that right?
That's an interesting question. As a web designer, I always try to make them brief, because I use a lot of images in my work. And when I'm creating a website, my tendency over the past few years has been to go image first instead of content first. And so this is part of how I'm educating myself on inclusive design. When I make short alt text, it's often for my own benefit and not for the user, because I want to get it done fast and get it out of the way. But when I think of that success kid meme, you know, if I put in a short piece of alt text there, am I really making it perceivable? Or am I just cutting a corner? But if I have long alt text, I'm able to make it more perceivable for the user. And I haven't asked a screen reader user about this. I would be interested to find out what they think. But it's my impression that longer alt text would be better, because the longer alt text will give a more in-depth description of the image. And if there's a lot happening in the image, if there's photography and text, and if it's something like a meme where we convey a whole lot visually, I could see how a longer alt text would make it a better user experience for a screen reader, but I don't see any deficiency in making it long. Like if we have a long alt text, it doesn't decrease the bandwidth of the site. It doesn't make a deficient user experience for anyone, but it only augments. So I'm not 100% sure, but my thought, Courtney, is that longer probably is better.
A lot of the, oh sorry, Hazel speaking, thank you. A lot of the technologies I've used, the like Blackboard, for example, Courtney, it has a very short alt text, so you are actually limited sometimes by the technology rather than what is probably best design, unfortunately. Thank you for this seminar, Caelan. It's very thought-provoking.
Yeah, you bring up a great point about the character count limitation, because I often see that in alt text input, and I'm not sure why it's there. You know, there may be some programming reason that I don't know about, why a longer alt text could create a heavier load, or it might just be to prevent spammers from putting a whole bunch of junk code in there. I'm not sure what it is, but from a usability standpoint, it doesn't make sense to me. Do you have any thoughts, Hazel?
I agree. From a usability perspective, it doesn't make any sense. Hazel speaking. That's going to take me a while to put in, but it's a great thing to do. Yeah, I think partly it's probably to keep the character count down, and not all those technologies like Blackboard and WordPress, which we use for our blog, Courtney, they're designed for like lots of people to use. And so even though you might be a ethical user, that doesn't mean that everyone using those platforms is, and you can put a lot of junk code and hidden links and things in there.
True. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Well, tell me something. What's something that you've learned today that you're going to implement sometime in August to make what you create more accessible?
The audio descriptions of slides. Hazel speaking, I'm going to be making a new module for our courses, and I can implement that now in my design of my lectures.
Well done. That'll be great.
For me, Jana speaking, two sort of things. The realization that polls are not accessible is a big one, and just sort of being more aware of that and trying to, as you say, find other ways for people to participate than just assuming that everyone can use it as is. And then I liked the reminder too of less text and bigger fonts. Sometimes with a lot of our folks presenting technical information, just their slides are kind of a nightmare from a design perspective anyways, but this is another reminder for them that there's multiple reasons why you shouldn't have just a super text heavy slide. So
Right. And I like what Marcus Osterberg says, that, yeah, it's great for impairments, but it's also great for everyone else too. Hannah says that she's going to ensure that alt text is filled in. Well done, Hannah. That's great. What about you, Courtney? Anything that you've learned today that you're going to implement in August?
Yeah, totally. I'm in the process of redesigning an online course now, so this is all sort of at the forefront of my mind, which is fabulous. Jana, lecturers are also renowned for having visually horrendous slides. And I was sort of potentially from a design aesthetic standpoint, and am now sort of thinking that I'm actually going to have to sort of put a good amount of thought into things like contrast and font size and white space on the page or what have you, to strike that balance between accessibility and visual nicety. So yeah, very, very much appreciated those thoughts and tips.
Great. I'm really happy to hear that. Well, what we've all done is we've learned a little bit about accessibility today. And over the course of the next few weeks, few months, I encourage you to share an accessibility tip now and again when the opportunity presents itself, when you're collaborating with someone else, or when you have the chance to note, hey, if we do this way, it'll make it more accessible. Try and spread what you've learned with others so that we can raise that tide, and a rising tide lifts all boats. So let's go make an accessible world, team.
thank you,
Caelan.
Thanks so much. It was great spending time with you today. Good luck out there.
Thanks. See ya.